fully expected to find a constable in the kitchen waiting to take me up, but not only was there no constable there was no discovery had yet been made of the robbery. Miss Joe was prodigiously busy in getting the house ready for the festivities of the day, and Joe had been put upon the kitchen door, step to keep him out of the dustpan, an article into which his destiny always led him sooner or later when my sister was vigorously reaping the floors of her establishment. "And where the deuce have you been?" was Mrs. Joy's Christmas salutation when I and my conscience showed ourselves. I said I had been down to hear the carols. "Ah, well," observed Miss Joe, "you might have done worse. Not a doubt of that," I thought. "Perhaps if I wasn't a blacksmith's wife, and what's the same thing, a slave with her apron never off, I should have been to hear the carols," said Miss Joe. "I'm rather partial to carols myself, and that's the best reason for my never hearing of any." Joe, who had ventured into the kitchen after me as the dustpan had retired before us, drew the back of his hands across his nose with a conciliatory air when Miss Joe darted a look at him, and when her eyes were withdrawn, secretly crossed two forefingers and established them to me as our taken that Miss Joe was in a cross temper. This was so much her normal state that Joe and I would often for weeks together be as to our fingers like monumental crusaders as to their feet. We were to have a superb dinner consisting of a leg of a pickled pork and greens and a pair of roast stuffed fowls. A handsome mince pie had been made yesterday morning, which accounted for the mincemeat not being used, and the pudding was already in the boil. These extensive arrangements occasioned us to be cut off unceremoniously in respect for breakfast, "for I ain't," said Miss Joe, "I ain't going to have no formal cramming and busting and washing up now what I've got before me, I promise you." So when we had our slices served out, as if we were 2,000 troops on a forced march instead of a man and a boy at home, and we took gulps of milk and water, with apologetic constances, from a jug in the dresser, in the meantime Miss Joe put clean white curtains up, and tackled a new flowered flounce across the wide chimney to replace the old one, and uncovered the little state parlor across this passage, which was never uncovered at any time, but passed the rest of the year in a cool haze of silver paper, which was extended to the four little crockery pottles on the mantel-shelf, each with a black nose and a basket of flowers in his mouth, and each the counterpart of the other. Miss Joe was a very clean housekeeper, but had an extensive art of making her cleanliness more uncomfortable and unacceptable than dirt itself. Cleanliness is next to godliness, and some people do the same by their religion. My sister, having so much to do, was going to church vicariously, that is to say, Joe and I were going. In his working clothes, Joe was a well-knit, characteristic-looking blacksmith. In his holiday clothes, he was more like a scarecrow in good circumstances than anything else. Nothing that he wore then fitted him or seemed to belong to him, and everything that he wore then grazed him. On the present festive occasions, he emerged from his room when the Blitz bells were going, the picture of misery, in a full suit of Sunday potentials. As to me, I think my sister must have had some general idea that I was a young offender whom an Ankara policeman had taken up on my birthday and delivered over to her to be dealt with according to the outraged majesty of the law. I was always treated as if I had insisted on being born in opposition to the dictates of reason, religion, and morality, and against the dissuading arguments of my best friends. Even when I was taken to have a new suit of clothes, the tailor had orders to make them like a kind of reformatory, and on no account to let me have the free use of my limbs. Joe and I going to church, therefore, must have been a moving spectacle for the compassionate minds. Yet what I suffered outside was nothing to what I underwent within. The terrors that had assailed me whenever Miss Joe had gone near the pantry or out of the room were only to be equaled by the remorse with which my mind dwelt on what my hand had done. Under the weight of my wicked secret, I pondered whether the church would be powerful enough to shield me from the vengeance of the terrible young man if I divulged to that establishment. I conceived the idea that the time when the banns were read and when the clergyman said, "Ye are now to declare it," would be the last time for me to rise and propose a private conference in the vestry. I am far from being sure that I might not have astonished our small congregation by retorting to this extreme measure, but for its being Christmas Day and no Sunday. Mr. Wopsle, the clerk at church, was to dine with us, and Mr. Hubble, the wheelwright, and Mrs. Hubble, and Uncle Pumblechook, Joe's uncle, but Miss Joy appointed him, was a well-to-do corn chandler in the nearby town, and drove his own chaise cart. The dinner hour was 1:30 when Joe and I got home. We found the table laid and Miss Joe dressed and the dinner dressing, and the front door unlocked. It was never at any other time for the company to enter by, and everything most splendid, and still not a word of the robbery. The time came without bringing with it any relief to my feelings, and the company came. Mr. Wopsle, united to a Roman nose and a large shining bald forehead, had a deep voice which he was uncommonly proud of. Indeed, it was understood among his acquaintance that if you could give him his head, he would read the clergyman into fits. He himself confessed that if the church was thrown open and meaning to competition, he would not despair of making his mark in it. The church not being thrown open, he was, as I have said, our clerk. But he punished the amens tremendously, and when he gave out the psalm, always giving the whole verse, he looked all round the congregation first, as much to say, "You have heard my friend overheard. Oblige me with your opinion of this style." I opened the door to my company, making believe that it was a habit of ours to open that door, and I opened it first to Mr. Wopsle, next to Mr. and Mrs. Hubble, and last of all to Uncle Pumblechook. N.B. I was not allowed to call him uncle, under the severest penalties. "Miss Joe," said Uncle Pumblechook, a large, hard, breathing, middle-aged, slow man, with a mouth like a fish, dull staring eyes, and sandy hair standing upright on his head, so that he looked as if he had all been but choked, and had that moment come to. "I have brought you as the compliments of the season. I have brought you, Mum, a bottle of sherry wine, and I have brought you, Mum, a bottle of port wine." Every Christmas Day he presented himself as a profound novelty, with exactly the same words, and carrying the 2 bottles like dumbbells. Every Christmas Day Miss Joe replied, as she now replied, "Oh, Uncle Pumblechook, this is kind." Every Christmas Day he retorted, as he now retorted, "It's no more than your merits, and now are you all bobbish, and how's 6 penn'orth of halfpence," meaning me. We dined on these occasions in the kitchen, and adjourned for the nuts and oranges and apples to the parlor, which was a change very like Joe's change from his working clothes to his Sunday dress. My sister was uncommonly lively on the present occasion, and indeed was generally more gracious in the society of Miss Hubble than in other company. I remember that Miss Hubble as a little curly, sharp-edged person in sky blue, who held a conveniently juvenile position, because she had married Mr. Hubble, I do not know at which remote period, when she was much younger than he. I remember Mr. Hubble as a tough, high-shouldered, stooping old man of a sawdusty fragrance, with his legs extraordinarily wide apart, so that in my short days I always saw some miles of open country between them when I met him coming up the lane. Among this company, I should have felt myself, even if I hadn't robbed the pantry, in a false position, not because I was squeezed in an acute angle of the tablecloth, with the table in my chest, and the Pumblechookian elbow in my eye, nor because I was not allowed to speak, I didn't want to speak, nor because I was regaled with the scaly tips of the drumsticks of the fowls, and with those obscure corners of the pork of which the pig, when living, had had the least reason to be vain. No, I should not have minded that, if they would only have left me alone. But they wouldn't leave me alone. They seemed to think the opportunity lost if they failed to point the conversation at me every now and then, and stick the point into me. I might have been an unfortunate little bull in a Spanish area. I got so smartingly touched up by these moral goads. It began the moment we sat down to dinner. Mr. Wopsle said grace with theatrical declamation, as it now appears to me, something like a religious cross of the ghost in Hamlet with Richard III, and ended with the very proper aspiration that we might be truly grateful, upon which my sister fixed me with her eye, and said in a low, reproachful voice, "Do you hear that? Be grateful." "Especially," said Mr. Pumblechook, "be grateful, boy, to those who brought you up by hand." Mrs. Hubble shook her head and contemplated me with a mournful presentiment that I should come to no good, asked, "Why is it that the young are never grateful?" This moral mystery seemed too much for the company until Mr. Hubble tersely solved it by saying, "Notoriously vicious." Everybody then murmured true, and looked at me in a particular unpleasant and personal manner. Joe's station and influence was something feebler, if possible, when there was company. Then, when there was none. When there were none. But he always aided me and comforted me when he could in some ways of his own, and he always did so at dinner time by giving me gravy, if there was any. There being lots of gravy today, Joe spooned into my lap at this point about half a pint. A little later on in the dinner, Mr. Wopsle revived the sermon with some severity and intimated, in the usual hypothetical case of the church being thrown open, what kind of sermon he would have been given. After favoring them with some heads of this discourse, he remarked that he considered the subjects of the day homily ill-chosen, which was excusable, he added, when there are so many subjects going about. "True again," said Uncle Pumblechook. "You've hit it, sir. Plenty of subjects going about for them that know how to put salt upon their tails. That's what's wanted. A man needn't go far to find a subject if he's ready with the salt box." Mr. Pumblechook added, after a short interval of reflection, "Look at pork alone. There's a subject. If you want a subject, look at pork." "True, sir. Many a moral for the young," returned Mr. Wopsle, and I knew he was going to lug me in before he said it. Might be deduced from that text. "You listen to this," said my sister to me in a severe parenthesis. Joe gave me some gravy. "Swine," pursued Mr. Wopsle in his deepest voice, and pointing his fork at my blushes as if he was mentioning my Christian name. "Swine were the compassions of the prodigal. The gluttony of swine is put before us as an example to the young. I thought this pretty well in him who had been praising up the pork for being so plump and juicy. What is detestable in a pig is more detestable in a boy." "Or a girl," suggested Mr. Hubble. "Of course, or a girl, Mr. Hubble," assented Mr. Wopsle rather irritably, "but there is no girl present." "Besides," said Mr. Pumblechook, turning sharp on me, "think what you've got to be grateful for. If you had been born a squeaker—" "He was, if ever a child was," said my sister most emphatically. Joe gave me some more gravy. "Well, but I mean a 4-footed squeaker," said Mr. Pumblechook. "If you had been born with such, would you have been here now, not you." "Unless in that form," said Mr. Wopsle, nodding towards the dish. "But I don't mean in that form, sir," returned Mr. Pumblechook, who had an objection to being interrupted. "I mean enjoying himself with his elders and betters, and improving himself with their conversation, and rolling in the lap of luxury. Would he have been doing that? No, he wouldn't. And what would have been your destination?" Turning on me again. "You would have been disposed of for so many shillings according to the market price of the article, and Dunstable the butcher would have come up to you as if to lay you in the straw, and he would have whipped you under his left arm, and his right arm would have been tucked up to his frock to get a penknife from his waistcoat pocket, and he would have shed your blood and had your life. No bringing up by hand then, not a bit of it." Joe offered me more gravy, which I was afraid to take. "He was in a world of trouble to you, ma'am," said Miss Hubble, commiserating my sister. "Trouble," echoed my sister. "Trouble," and then entered on a fearful catalogue of all the illnesses I had been guilty of, and all the acts of sleepiness I had committed, and all the high places I had tumbled from, and all the low places I had tumbled into, and all the injuries I had done to myself, and all the times she had wished me in my grave, and I had continuously refused to go there. I think the Romans must have aggravated one another very much with their noses. Perhaps they had become the restless people they were in a consequence. Anyhow, Mr. Wopsle's Roman nose so aggravated me during the recital of his misdemeanors that I should have liked to pull it until he howled. But all I had endured up to this time was nothing in comparison with the awful feelings that took possession of me when the pause was broken, which ensued upon my sister's recital, and in which pause everyone had looked at me, as I felt painfully conscious, with indignation and abhorrence. "Yet," said Mr. Pumblechook, leading the company gently back to the theme from which they had strayed, "pork, regarding its build, is rich too, ain't it?" "Have a little brandy, uncle," said my sister. Oh heavens, it had come at last. He would find he would find it was weak. Would say it was weak, and I was lost. I held tight to the leg of the table upon the cloth with both hands and awaited my fate. My sister went for the stone bottle, came back with the stone bottle, and poured his brandy out, no one else taking any. The wretched man trifled with his glass, took it up, looked at it through the light, put it down, prolonged my misery. All this time, Miss Joe and Joe were briskly clearing the table for the pie and pudding. I couldn't keep my eyes off him, always holding tight to the leg of the table with my hands and feet. I saw the miserable creature finger his glass playfully, take it up, smile, throw his head back, and drink the brandy off. Instantly afterwards, the company were seized with unspeakable consternation, owing to his springing up to his feet, turning round several times in an appalling, spasmodic whooping, cough dance, and rushing out the door. He then became visible through the window, violently plunging and expirating, making the most hideous faces, and apparently out of his mind. I held on tight while Mrs. Joe and Joe ran to him. I didn't know how I had done it, but I had no doubt I had murdered him somehow in my dreadful situation. It was a relief when he was brought back, and surveying the company all around as if they had disagreed with him, sank into his chair with one significant gasp. Tar. I had filled up the bottle from the tar water jug. I knew he would have been worse by and by. I moved the table like a medium of the present day by the vigor of my unseen hold upon it. Tar! Cried my sister in amazement. Why, how ever tar come there? But Uncle Pumblechook, who was omnipresent in that kitchen, wouldn't hear the word, wouldn't hear of the subject, imperiously waving it all away with his hand, and asking for hot gin and water. My sister, who had begun to be alarmingly meditative, had to employ herself actively in getting the gin, the hot water, the sugar, and the lemon peel, and mixing them together. For the time being, at least, I was saved. I still held on to the leg of the table and clutched it now with the fervor of gratitude. By degrees, I became calm enough to release my grasp and partake of pudding. Mr. Pumblechook partook of pudding. All partook of pudding. The course terminated, and Mr. Pumblechook had begun to beam under the genial influence of gin and water. I began to think I should get over the day when my sister said to Joe, "Clean plates cold." I clutched the table again immediately and pressed it to my bosom as if I had the companion of my youth and friend of my soul. I foresaw what was coming, and I felt that this time I really was gone. "You must taste," said my sister, addressing the guests with their best grace. "You must taste to finish with such a delightful and delicious present of Uncle Pumblechook's. Must they? Let them not hope to taste it. You must know," said my sister, rising. "It's a pie, a savory pork pie." The company murmured their compliments. Uncle Pumblechook, sensible of having deserved well of his fellow creatures, said quite vivaciously, "All things considered, well, Miss Joe, we'll do our best endeavors. Let us have a cut at this same pie." My sister went out to get it. I heard her steps proceed to the pantry. I saw Mr. Pumblechook balance his knife. I saw reawakened appetite in the Roman nostrils of Mr. Wopsle. I heard Mr. Hubble remark that a bit of savory pork pie would lay atop of anything you could mention and do no harm, and I heard Joe say, "You shall have some, Pip." I have never been absolutely certain whether I uttered a shrill yell of terror merely in spirit or in the bodily hearing of the company. I felt that I could bear no more, and that I must run away. I released the leg of the table and ran for my life. But I ran no further than the house door, for there I ran head foremost into a party of soldiers with their muskets, one of whom held out a pair of handcuffs to me, saying, "Hey, look sharp, come on."